They laughed at his shoes first, then his car. Then the way he counted out crumpled bills for his son's school lunch, right there in front of everyone. Marcus Webb said nothing. He just knelt down, tied his 8-year-old sneaker, and told him softly that today would be a good day. What none of them knew, not the smirking mother by the drop-off line, not the school board member filming it for a laugh, was who Marcus really was, and how many of their futures he already controlled. By the end of the week, one of them would be begging him for mercy. Who do you think it'll be? The moving truck pulled away just after noon, leaving Sarah Mitchell standing in the driveway of 214 Maple Crest Lane with her hands on her hips and a smile she hadn't worn in months. The house was small by the neighborhood standards, pale blue siding, a young maple tree out front, a porch just wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. But it was hers. Paid for, free and clear, with money she'd saved every month for 6 years. She breathed in fresh-cut grass, someone's charcoal grill a few houses down, the particular sharpness of new paint drying in the sun. It smelled like starting over. "Mom, can I go see if there's other kids?" Jake was already halfway down the driveway, sneakers untied, backpack forgotten on the porch steps. "Stay where I can see you," Sarah called, and he grinned and bolted toward a cul-de-sac, where 3 or 4 kids were riding bikes in lazy circles. For a moment, she just watched him go. 8 years old, and he'd already lived in 4 different houses, 2 different states, and 1 extended stretch with his grandmother while Sarah did her second tour. This was supposed to be the one that stuck. Quiet street, good schools, a yard. A neighbor from 2 doors down, a heavy-set man in a Bears t-shirt watering a flower bed that didn't need it, lifted a hand in an easy wave. "Rough day for moving, supposed to hit 90 by 3. "Wouldn't be the first time I sweated through a workday," Sarah said, and he laughed, and something in her chest loosened a little. Maybe this really would be different. By early afternoon, the truck was empty, and the real work started. Not the boxes, those could wait, but the ramp. Sarah had bought the lumber herself, priced it out 3 times before she could afford it, and now she knelt in the gravel beside her front steps with a tape measure and a level. Sweat gathering at her hairline, marking out where the supports would go. Her left leg didn't like kneeling for long. 18 months since the convoy, since the blast that had taken most of the feeling below her knee and left her with a chair for the bad days and a cane for the in-between ones. Today was a cane day, mostly. But building a ramp meant a lot of getting up and down, and by her 3rd trip to the driveway for more screws, she was breathing hard. She didn't mind. She'd built harder things under worse conditions. And every board she set down was one more piece of a house that was actually finally, completely her own, modified exactly how she needed it, no landlord to ask permission from, no lease clause to violate. That thought was still warm in her chest when she noticed the woman. She was standing at the edge of Sarah's yard, not quite on the property and not quite off it, in white caprice and sunglasses pushed up into salon-perfect hair. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were on the half-built frame of the ramp, on the raw lumber, the exposed brackets, the neat stack of 2x4s waiting to become railings, with an expression Sarah couldn't quite place. Not curiosity. Something closer to distaste, like she'd found a stain on a carpet she'd just had cleaned. "You must be the new owner," the woman said, once Sarah had noticed her, and it would have been rude not to acknowledge it. "Sarah Mitchell." She stood, wiping her palm on her shorts before offering it. The woman didn't take it right away, and when she did, her grip was brief. "You're on the street, Diane Ashford, HOA president." She said it the way some people said judge or colonel, a title that came with weight already attached. Her gaze drifted back to the ramp frame. "That's quite a project." "Should have it finished by tomorrow," Sarah said, allowing herself a small flicker of pride. "I was in the Army, learned to build faster than most contractors, I'm sure." Diane's smile arrived a beat too late and didn't reach her eyes. "You'll want to check the covenant, though. Exterior modifications, additions, structural changes, anything visible from the street. They need board approval before construction begins, not after." A pause, light as a blade laid flat against skin. "We do like to keep things consistent here." Sarah felt the warmth in her chest cool by a few degrees. "It's a wheelchair ramp," she said carefully. "I have a service-connected disability. This isn't optional." Of course. Diane was already turning to go, the matter apparently settled in her own mind if nowhere else. "I'm sure the board will be happy to review it at the next meeting." She glanced once more at the lumber, at the half-driven screws glinting in the sun, and added, almost as an afterthought, "Try not to get too far along before then if you can help it." She walked off toward a house at the top of the cul-de-sac. The biggest one on the street, Sarah noted, with a circular driveway and a fountain out front, and didn't look back. Sarah stood there for a moment with the level still in her hand, watching Jake laugh with his new friends at the end of the road, and felt the first small, cold seed of something take root beneath the day's warmth. She had built ramps under fire. She was not about to be told no by a woman in white caprice. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but the ramp didn't wait for anyone's permission. Sarah finished it Sunday evening, testing the incline twice, running her hand along the railing to check for splinters before she ever let Jake near it. It was solid. It was code-compliant, ADA spec, better built than half the porches on the street. She photographed it from every angle, habit more than anything. The same instinct that made her document everything back when paperwork was the only thing standing between herself and getting steamrolled by someone with more rank. She'd need those photos sooner than she thought. The notice came Wednesday morning, taped to her front door in a plastic sleeve like a parking ticket. Violation of Section 4. 2. Unauthorized exterior modification. Corrective action required within 10 days. Daily fines to accrue thereafter. No signature, no phone call, no conversation. Just a laminated threat waiting for her when she opened the door to get the mail. Jake found her standing on the porch holding it. Is that bad, Mom? It's nothing, Bug. Go grab your backpack. She kept her voice light until he was back inside, and only then did she read it again. Slower, feeling something in her jaw tighten. She called the HOA's management office that afternoon. Diane didn't answer personally, of course she didn't, but the woman who did, a bored-sounding assistant named Patrice, read from what was clearly a script. The board took modifications seriously. The board had a process. The board would review the matter at its discretion. When Sarah mentioned the words Reasonable Accommodation and Fair Housing Act, there was a pause on the line, and then Patrice said, not unkindly, that she'd pass that along, which Sarah had learned in 20 years of dealing with bureaucracies, was a phrase that meant nothing at all. She went to the next board meeting anyway. Community room at the clubhouse, folding chairs, a folder of documents she'd printed at the library because her own printer was still in a box somewhere. She'd worn her one blazer, the interview one, and pulled her hair back the way she used to for formation. Diane sat at the head of the table like she'd been carved into the position. 2 other board members flanked her. An older man who spent the whole meeting on his phone, and a younger woman who wouldn't quite meet Sarah's eyes. When Sarah's item came up on the agenda, Diane didn't even let her finish her opening sentence. We understand there are circumstances, Diane said, folding her hands. But the covenant exists for a reason. Property values in this community depend on a certain aesthetic consistency. Ramps, in particular, tend to be visually disruptive. It's the law, Sarah said. Federal law. I don't need the board's permission to install an accessibility modification. I'm required to notify you, which I'm doing right now retroactively, because nobody told me otherwise until I already had shovels in the ground. Well, Diane's smile was thin as paper. Perhaps in the Army things worked differently. Here, we have a process. A few of the dozen or so residents scattered in folding chairs behind Sarah shifted audibly. Someone coughed. Nobody said anything. I have combat injuries, Sarah said, keeping her voice level in a way that cost her more than anyone in that room could know. I have a doctor's letter. I have photographs showing the ramp meets code. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm telling you what I'm legally entitled to. And the board will take that under advisement, Diane said, already gathering her papers, already moving to the next item like Sarah's entire life was a line item to be tabled. Fines will continue to accrue in the meantime per policy. Consistency matters. Sarah sat through the rest of the meeting because leaving would have felt like losing, and she did not lose things she'd already decided to win. But she memorized in that hour exactly what kind of woman Diane Ashford was. The kind who used the word policy the way other people used a closed door. The fine started at $50 a day. By the second week, they'd climbed to $75. Sarah kept the ramp exactly where it was, kept every letter in a folder, kept a log of every phone call, every name, every timestamp, and kept smiling at the neighbors who waved at her on the street, because most of them, she was starting to realize, had no idea any of this was happening. Diane ran the HOA the way some officers ran a unit. Information tightly controlled, dissent quietly buried, appearances immaculate. It was Jake who made it personal in a way the fines never could. He came home from the bus stop one afternoon, with his shoulders pulled up around his ears, the particular posture of an 8-year-old trying not to cry in public. Sarah crouched to his level on the porch. The ramp made that easier now. She didn't have to fold herself down the same way, and asked him what happened. Tyler said we're gonna get kicked out, Jake said. He said his mom said we don't belong here because we broke the rules, and now everybody hates us. Tyler's mother sat on the board. Sarah had seen her at the meeting, silent, scrolling her phone. That night, after Jake was asleep, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, one of the few pieces of furniture she'd fully unpacked, and opened her laptop. She wasn't naive. She knew HOAs like this one weren't really about ramps or aesthetics or covenants. They were about power, small and petty and disproportionate to anything that actually mattered, wielded by people who'd never had it tested against something real. Diane Ashford had built her authority on the assumption that everyone in her path was exactly as powerless as they looked. A single mom, a veteran with a cane, someone who'd write angry letters, maybe hire a lawyer she couldn't afford, eventually get tired and either comply or move. What Diane didn't know, what nobody on Maple Crest Lane knew, because Sarah had never once mentioned it, not to the friendly neighbor with the flower beds, not at the board meeting, not even to Jake in any real detail, was where the money for this house had actually come from. 6 years of saving, yes, but also a settlement. A patent filed years earlier with an old Army buddy for a piece of prosthetic technology that had, in the 18 months since her injury, gone from a garage project to a licensing deal with 3 major manufacturers. Sarah Mitchell did not need to fight the HOA over $50 fines because she was worried about the money. She was worried about precedent, about what happened to the next disabled veteran who moved onto this street without the resources to fight back. She opened a new document and began typing a letter, not to the board, not yet, but to a name from her contact list she hadn't called in over a year. A former JAG officer turned civil rights attorney who owed her exactly one favor and had been waiting, Sarah suspected, for a reason interesting enough to use it on. She had wanted badly to disappear quietly into an ordinary life. Diane Ashford, without knowing it, had just made that impossible. The next board meeting was in 3 weeks. Sarah intended to walk in with a folder considerably thicker than the last one, and this time, she wouldn't be the only person in the room who understood exactly what was about to happen to Diane Ashford's tidy little kingdom. The second board meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock. Sarah arrived at 6:40, and by 6:50 the community room was fuller than she'd ever seen it. Word had apparently spread that something was going to happen tonight, though nobody but Sarah and the man sitting quietly beside her knew exactly what. His name was Daniel Ochoa, and if you'd passed him in the parking lot, you'd have guessed accountant, maybe insurance adjuster. Mid-50s, gray suit, a leather folio tucked under one arm. Nobody in that room recognized him as one of the more feared civil rights litigators in the state, the kind of attorney corporations settled with, rather than faced in front of a jury. He'd flown in that afternoon as a favor to a woman who'd once pulled him out of a burning vehicle and never once mentioned it again. Diane Ashford took her seat at the head of the table at exactly 7, radiant, with the particular confidence of someone who believed the outcome of the evening was already decided. She'd added an item to the agenda since the last meeting. Sarah had seen it posted on the community board that morning. Item 7. Consideration of formal sanctions, Unit 214. Sanctions turned out to mean a lien on Sarah's house. Diane explained it almost cheerfully when the item came up, reading from a prepared statement about accumulated fines. Now well over $2,000, and the board's authority, per the covenant, to place a lien against any property with an outstanding balance exceeding 60 days. This is a formality, Diane said, glancing at Sarah with something close to satisfaction. We did try to work with you, but rules exist for everyone, Ms. Mitchell. No exceptions. I'd like to respond, Sarah said, standing. Diane made a small gesture, magnanimous. Let her have her moment. Go ahead. Though I should say, the board has already reviewed the legal basis for this action extensively. Then you'll want to hear this. Sarah nodded to Daniel, who rose and opened his folio with the unhurried calm of a man who had done this exact thing in front of far more intimidating rooms than this one. My name is Daniel Ochoa, he said, and something in the easy authority of his voice made the room go very still. I'm an attorney. I specialize in disability rights and fair housing law, and I'm here representing Ms. Mitchell. Diane's smile didn't drop immediately. It just went slightly rigid, the way a smile does when the person wearing it senses something but hasn't located it yet. What your board has done here, Daniel continued, is a textbook violation of the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation provisions, compounded by a retaliatory fine structure that a federal court is going to find extremely difficult to characterize as coincidental. Ms. Mitchell notified this board, in writing, of a documented service-connected disability. She provided medical documentation. She provided code compliance photographs. And this board's response was to impose escalating financial penalties and now attempt to place a lien on a disabled combat veteran's home. He set a folder on the table, sliding it toward the center where every board member could see it. That's a summary of the applicable statutes, along with a formal notice of intent to file, HUD complaint, State Civil Rights Division, and a federal civil suit naming the association and each individual board member personally. Personally, he repeated, because under this state's HOA governance statute, board members who knowingly violate fair housing law in an official capacity can be held individually liable. Not the association's insurance. You, the older board member who'd spent the last meeting on his phone, was no longer on his phone. The younger woman had gone pale. Diane's voice had lost its polish. This is absurd. We were simply enforcing our covenant consistently. As we do for every resident, are your other residents disabled veterans denied timely accommodation review while fines accrued specifically during the appeal window? Daniel asked, mild as ever. Because I have your own management company's records obtained this afternoon, showing 11 modification requests processed in the last 2 years. All 11 approved within 30 days. Ms. Mitchell's was never formally reviewed at all. It was simply fined. A murmur moved through the folding chairs behind Sarah, the flowerbed neighbor. Others she'd waved to on the street. All of them hearing for the first time what had actually been happening 2 doors down. Diane's eyes found Sarah, and for the first time since Sarah had met her, something other than composure moved across her face. Something closer to fear. You should have just told me, Diane said, quieter now, almost to herself. If you'd explained, if you'd simply asked for an exception. I did, Sarah said, at the last meeting, in this room. You told me the Army does things differently, and consistency matters. She let that sit for a second in the silence of the community room. I'm not asking for an exception now, either. I'm telling you what happens next if this board doesn't rescind the fines, remove the lien filing, and issue written approval for the ramp tonight. You can't possibly. The association doesn't have the resources to fight federal litigation. No, Daniel agreed, you don't. Which is why I'd recommend the board reconsider Item 7 immediately, before this becomes a matter of public record instead of a private correction. Diane looked down at the folder in front of her like it might rearrange itself into something less catastrophic if she stared long enough. The younger board member leaned over and whispered something urgent. The man who'd been on his phone was now on his phone again, but frantically pulling up something, possibly a lawyer of his own. Will, Diane's voice cracked slightly, and she cleared her throat, tried again. The board will take a brief recess to review the matter. Take your time, Sarah said, and sat back down beside Daniel, her hands steady on the folder in her lap, while behind her the room buzzed with 24 neighbors realizing, all at once, exactly what kind of person had been running their community, and exactly who had just walked in and ended it. Diane didn't come back from that recess the same woman who'd left the table. The recess lasted 11 minutes. Sarah knew because she counted them, the way she used to count minutes in far worse waiting rooms, far worse rooms altogether, and found that 11 minutes was nothing at all compared to what she'd already survived. When the board filed back to the table, Diane wasn't leading them anymore. The younger board member, whose name Sarah would later learn was Priya Anand, was the one who sat down first and spoke first, reading from a hastily scrawled note in handwriting that wasn't Diane's. The board rescinds all fines associated with Unit 214, Priya said, effective immediately. The lien filing is withdrawn. The modification, the ramp, is approved retroactively as fully compliant. She glanced at Diane, who was staring at a point somewhere past Sarah's shoulder, and the board would like to extend a formal apology to Ms. Mitchell for the handling of this matter. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but the room exhaled all at once. 24 neighbors who'd spent the last 20 minutes learning things about their community they hadn't known that morning, and something in the collective posture of the room shifted, towards Sarah, not away from her. Daniel closed his folio without ceremony. We'll want that in writing, with the specific statutory language we discussed, by end of week. Ms. Mitchell isn't seeking damages tonight. She's seeking compliance. I'd strongly recommend the board keep it that way by not making her seek anything further. Diane said nothing. She hadn't said anything since the recess ended, and she said nothing for the rest of the meeting, sitting at the head of a table she no longer fully controlled. While Priya and the phone-scrolling man, whose name Sarah now knew was Gerald, handled the remaining agenda items with the careful, over-polite efficiency of people trying to prove they were the reasonable ones all along. What happened to Diane Ashford in the weeks that followed wasn't a single dramatic downfall. It was smaller than that, and in its way more thorough. Two other residents, emboldened by what they'd witnessed, came forward with their own stories. A modification request buried for 4 months without response. A fine levied against an elderly widower for a garden bed Diane had personally found tacky. Nothing illegal. Most of it, just small and petty and finally visible in a way it had never been when Diane controlled every piece of information that reached the community. At the next annual election, Diane didn't run for board president again. She didn't run for anything. She sold her house 8 months later, the big one with the circular driveway and the fountain, and the general understanding on Maple Crest Lane was that she and her husband had decided to downsize, though nobody quite believed that was the whole story. Sarah never told anyone about the patent, or the settlement, or the fact that she could have hired a dozen attorneys like Daniel Ochoa without noticing the expense. It had never been about proving she had resources. It had been about proving that she didn't need them to be treated like a person whose rights mattered. That the law itself, applied properly, was supposed to be enough. The money had only ever been the thing that let her follow through when someone tried to bank on her giving up. Jake noticed the change before he understood it. The kids at the bus stop stopped repeating whatever their parents had been saying at dinner. Tyler's mother, in a small and unremarked act of course correction, brought a plate of cookies to the door one Sunday and stayed 20 minutes longer than the cookies required. The ramp stayed exactly where Sarah had built it, sturdier by then than half the porches on the street, weathered by a few months of rain into something that looked less like a controversy and more like it had simply always belonged there. 6 months later, the HOA newsletter, under Priya's editorship now, ran a short feature on accessibility and inclusion in the community, illustrated with a photo of a ramp leading up to a pale blue house with a young maple tree out front. Sarah hadn't asked for it. She hadn't objected to it either. Some fights end with an apology. The good ones end with the thing you were fighting for becoming so unremarkable that nobody remembers it was ever in question. She thought about Diane sometimes. Not with satisfaction exactly, though there was some of that too, but mostly with a kind of clinical clarity she recognized from her years in uniform. Diane hadn't been evil. She'd simply mistaken a quiet demeanor for an absence of power, mistaken a folding chair and a modest house for the whole of a person's story. It was a mistake people made more often than they should, and it rarely cost them anything. Until every so often it did. Sarah kept the folder. The letters, the fine notices, the photographs, the transcript Daniel had insisted on requesting from the meeting, not out of bitterness. She kept it the way she kept certain things from her service, not because she needed reminding of what had happened, but because somewhere down the line, some other veteran, some other single parent, some other person who looked easy to dismiss might need to know exactly what steps to take when the folding chairs filled up, and somebody who thought they held all the power tried to make them disappear quietly. On a warm evening in early autumn, Sarah sat on her front porch with Jake, watching him practice riding his bike up and down the smooth new incline of the ramp like it was the most natural thing in the world. No longer a battlefield, just a piece of the house. A neighbor walking her dog lifted a hand in the easy, unremarkable wave of someone who'd simply come to think of Sarah as one more person on the street. No asterisk attached. She thought about the letter that had started it all, taped to her door in a plastic sleeve. Unauthorized exterior modification. As if a woman who had rebuilt her body, her family, and her entire life from scratch could ever be reduced to a violation of Section 4. 2S. People will always underestimate what they can't be bothered to understand. The only question that matters is what you do the moment they find out they were wrong.